service if they need it. We have Cantonese and Spanish interpreters on the line. If you can see the instructions on your screen, you can quickly follow the guide to select the language of your choice and hear the interpreter in your language. Thank you. And now Mayor Schaaf will do her opening comments.
Thank you so much. While people come together to gather in this blessed exercise that the City of Oakland does once every 2 years, it is so exciting to see the level of interest from the public, from our many community leaders, in how the city's budget works. This is going to be a difficult budget year, although not as difficult as we thought it might be 1 month ago. We are so relieved that the federal government, under the leadership of our newly elected president and vice president, Oakland daughter, Kamala Harris, and of course, President Biden, were able to successfully pass, by the narrowest of margins, the American Rescue Act. The American Rescue Act is the Oakland Rescue Act. For the first time, it is aid that not only goes to address our most vulnerable residents, our struggling small businesses, but also recognizes that local and state governments have also been hit hard by the economic impacts of COVID-19, and that the devastating impacts to our revenues have really endangered city services that our residents are relying on now more than ever. So it is with great pleasure that we share with you that rescue is on the way to the city's budget, and that is going to make this year's budget process much less painful than it otherwise would have been. Every year we do an exercise of a 5-year forecast, and it always shows that our anticipated revenues are not quite enough to meet what has been our baseline standard of services, and it is never near what we all know the tremendous needs are in our community. And not just needs, but dreams. And that is where the budget process comes in. It is where we have to be creative and think about how we use these limited resources in a way that leverages more resources, draws on partnerships, collaborates and coordinates with other layers of government, particularly in this moment, our county government, which runs our public health systems, our mental health and behavioral health systems, our state government, which provides so much critical funding for things like homelessness and housing. So these are our challenges and our opportunities. I want to just highlight what the budget process is going to look like this year so that you know where your voice is going to make the biggest difference. Right now, I am gathering public input to influence the proposed budget that myself and the city administrator, Ed Riskin, must prepare by law by May 1st. On May 1st, we will make publicly available a proposed budget. It will be heard by the city council shortly thereafter, but this is the starting place. The final decision on the budget is held by the city council. So once Ed and I have done our job of proposing a budget, over those next really month and a half, May and the first part of June, the council members will be holding town halls. They will be soliciting your advice and suggestions and advocacy to react to the proposed budget, to suggest modifications or changes. But that is another place where you can influence the city's budget. Right now, I'm the person you should be yelling at. And then starting in May, the city council is going to be the focus of advocacy efforts. The city council must adopt a balanced budget before July 1st. That is the beginning of our next fiscal year. So those are the opportunities that you have to influence the budget in this next critical few months, and that budget will be in place for the next 2 fiscal years. Last, I want to conclude by saying that your advocacy has always made a huge difference in what our budget is, and how we move forward with our city services. And I am absolutely positive that this year will be no different. In our last budget 2 years ago, we heard clearly from the community that you wanted more investment to solve homelessness, to invest in more affordable housing, and to make our streets cleaner and safer with more illegal dumping crews, with special compassionate attention to our unhoused neighbors and the impacts of encampments. And that is how this last budget had the very biggest growth in investments in those 3 areas. 4 years ago, I can remember your advocacy around the street conditions, the potholes, and again, growing concern about the displacement of Oaklanders out of Oakland because of the rising cost of living. And that advocacy resulted in us putting Measure KK on the ballot. And because of Measure KK, we have more than 10 times increased the paving of local roads, something that was not possible under previous funding sources. And it is your advocacy that led to the creation of that ballot measure. And of course, last year, I saw Brooke Levin on the line. Community leaders got together and put Measure Q on the ballot to really address the maintenance of our parks, to create more resources to address homelessness and the impacts of encampments. These are all things that started with you, with your advocacy, with your demands, with your articulation of where you think the city needs to do more, and a recognition that our existing resources are limited, and that we can only do so much by taking resources away from one thing and adding them to the other, that sometimes it takes you to organize and to create new sources of revenue, like was done with Measure Q and Measure KK, to make the changes that we all know are so needed in Oakland. And with that, I am very thrilled to pass this along to one of the hardest working women I know, our acting director of finance for the city of Oakland, Margaret O'Brien. Thank you so much for being here on your Saturday.
Good afternoon. I'm Margaret O'Brien. I am the interim finance director. We are going to bring you up to speed on the budget process, and then what our current deficit is. And Ekaterina, who is our principal budget analyst, will start by taking you through the budget basics.
Okay, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
So great, I'll start right now. So hi everyone, my name is Ekaterina Burton. I am the Senior Budget and Management Analyst in the City of Oakland. And we're going to jump right into discussing what it is, the city budget, and what is the process for how we do it. So as Mayor Schaaf has already shared, this is a 2-year budget cycle that we're in. And basically every other year, the staff, the mayor, and city council work together to produce a balanced budget by June 30th, which is what is required by our law. And currently we are working on the fiscal years 2021 to 2023. And as has been shared, we are in a similar strait as many other cities where we are facing unprecedented deficits due to the pandemic, and some very difficult choices will have to be made over the next few months in order to balance this budget. So next slide, please. So before we begin to dive into the budget, it's really important to go over how exactly our city's budget is funded. So we primarily get our revenues from local taxes, service fees, grants, and voter-approved bonds. But it's really important to note that of the taxes that are paid in Oakland, the city receives a portion of that revenue back. For instance, for every dollar that is paid in property tax, the city only receives 26% or 26 cents back. The rest goes to local agencies. Next slide, please. And that also means that when we're looking at the services that are provided in Oakland, that not all of those services are provided by the city itself. For instance, many of the essential services that our communities rely on are provided by other government agencies. For instance, transportation is provided by BART and AC Transit. Our education is provided by OUSD and the local community colleges through Peralta. Our clean water is provided by East Bay Municipal Utilities District. And our public health, mental health, and other services are provided by the county itself. So when you look at all the services that are given to residents in Oakland, you'll actually see that what the city is responsible for is only 42.5%. So not even the majority of the services. Next slide, please. And, when we talk about how much money we spend in Oakland, it comes out to around $1.7 billion. And that is what we are currently spending in this current fiscal year. And when you want to understand how the budget is broken down, really, the budget consists of over 300 funds, which are essentially groups of revenues and expenditures that must be individually balanced in each of those funds. Kind of think of it like we have like an individual checking account for each of those 300 funds. And really, when you look at all these funds, 62% of our funds are what we call restricted funds, because the types of activities that they support are normally established by local ordinance, the city charter, state law, or other grant agreements that basically say that those funds are for a very specific use, which means that we have only about 38% of our total budget that goes into what we call the general purpose fund, which is unrestricted and flexible in its use, and where we have as a say, as a community, kind of the most input on how that can be spent. Next slide, please. So when you look at our sources of funds, it's just important to know kind of where they are coming from. So over half of the revenue comes from our taxes, including property tax, sales tax, and hotel tax. Another big chunk of our revenue is what comes from our service charges and fines. So think about the things in our community like our parking meters, inspection fees, parking citations. That is that particular group of revenue. The other big chunk in our budget comes from grants that the city is really studious in acquiring for our residents. And those are things that we're getting from either entities like the federal government, the state government, and they basically fund programs that are really vital to our community, like Head Start, our affordable housing work, our workforce development programs. And, they really matter a lot, but again, they are for very specific uses. And finally, a part of our budget that may not necessarily be understandable when you first look at it, but it will make more sense when you spend more time with it, is what we call our transfers. And basically, the city has the ability to transfer funds between these different funding groups. Again, think of it as like moving something from your checking account to your savings account. And similarly, for some of our funds, we have what we call fund balance, which is, again, you can kind of see as like money that has not been allocated to something, but that we can use within that fund for the particular services that fund covers. And so that is also considered a transfer, is when we take money that is unallocated and use it towards the existing budget. So now that you have a sense of kind of how our revenues get used up in the budget, let's talk about how we need to balance the budget. Next slide, please. So as has been stated before, our requirement as a city is to pass a balanced budget, which basically means that for the revenue that the city is expected to get, that it equals the amount of money that the city plans to spend. We can't spend more than we're going to receive. And this applies to every single fund in our budget. So, think about it, 300 accounts. Those are what we have to balance overall. And that's a lot of work. And really what we're trying to balance is the costs of running our city itself. So this includes all of what makes up our services. So that is the salaries of the staff that are providing those services, other personnel costs that support our staff in providing those services, for instance, contracts, supplies. And this is what we're using in our revenue to do this work. And really what we have to really keep in mind for this particular budget, that because of the pandemic and these significant revenue declines that we are experiencing, that we really have to figure out the kind of balancing measures that will help us close this gap. And that brings us to discussing what are the values that are leading this conversation. So next slide, please. So one thing that's great about the city of Oakland is the commitment that all city staff have towards these particular values that are listed here on the screen. The biggest value that we're going to be using for deciding this year's budget is equity. And what equity means is that we really care about making sure that we are not continuing to contribute to racial disparities that exist within our community, and that we're doing our best to advance racial equity, which means we're choosing services that really go towards the benefit of our BIPOC communities, that is our Black, Indigenous, and other people of color communities who are disproportionately impacted, especially by the pandemic, and need services that help them through this time. The second thing that we also want to value as a city is our staff itself, who are providing these essential services. And so as much as we can prevent cuts to critical services and preserve our jobs for city workers, that is the second guiding value for this budget. And then the third value is fiscal responsibility. Just like anyone else during this time period, the city has to make sure that it can pay its bills. This not just matters for us to be able to continue our businesses, but this also matters for making sure that our staff get paid. And so, we really need to look at this short-term crisis about how can we make smart financial decisions so that we're really better able to rebound when the economy recovers. So this is a time for us all to think strategically about the services that we're investing in so that they best help our community, but also put us in the best state for rebounding after this all ends. And so that brings us back to the budget process itself. Next slide, please. So, as you all know, we are nearing April itself, and we've already done a number of significant things. For instance, the 5-year forecast has been presented to the city, so you can get an understanding of what our outlook is for the next 5 years. And the departments within our city have already submitted their budget proposals. And what is going to happen from here is that basically Mayor Libby Schaaf is going to be engaging with the community to get their insights and how they would want our services to be changed in this upcoming proposed budget. And between April and May, we are going to be working to put together a balanced budget. On May 1st, the budget will be released to the public, and that begins the part that we all enjoy, which is getting to deliberate with each other about how we're going to be spending this money. So bring your passion, bring your thoughts, because this is going to be a community process. And basically between now and June, these conversations between the mayor, council, and the public are going to be the driving forces in the final budget that we create, which will be passed on June 30th. So now that I have given you all this overview, I'm going to turn it over to Margaret O'Brien to discuss in particular what are the deficits that we're facing in this current year that are going to impact the budget process coming up.
Next slide, please. Thank you, Kat. Okay, so I'm confused as to what I am doing. Page down. My apologies, my screen started in the middle. The 2021 fiscal year deficit. A lot of people love to tag team around this thing. So Kat did a great job at laying out the budget process, and I just commend the budget staff. They're working under extraordinary conditions, and we've introduced new processes to the budget this year, and I'm tickled about the equity budget. I am just so thrilled. I could expound on it forever, and she did a great job. But right now, we are still in the middle of fiscal year 2021. And while we have the 2-year biennial process underway, we are still dealing with this current year's fiscal crisis. So meanwhile, the separate but related process in fiscal year 2021 is to address a $72 million budget deficit that we are currently facing in the general purpose fund. And so how much is that? What does that mean? What are we trying to deal with this year? So the COVID-19 pandemic has decimated our national and local economies. In June 2020, we addressed the deficit as part of our mid-year budget cycle. However, projections now show a growing potential deficit. Currently, we are facing a $72 million deficit in the general purpose fund. And this is one of the most serious, quickest, and I want to stress the quickest financial crises the city of Oakland has ever faced. The $72 million projection is based on data through December 2020, and we are still gather data. And in April, we will release our third quarter estimate, which will continue to discuss the deficit. We have published 20 reports since the beginning of the fiscal crisis, 20 reports that we have put out into the public realm to discuss this fiscal crisis. So what caused it? So in March of 2020, we all went into shelter in place. The economy slowed down associated with all the county and necessary county and state health orders. And the lockdowns have slashed our first quarter and second quarter tax revenues in four main categories. Hotel tax is severely down by 48%. Service fees are down. Fines and parking taxes are down. And just to give you a sense, our hotel tax, it took us almost 6 to 7 years to get to the point where the general purpose fund was generating almost $30 million a year in hotel taxes. We are severely down from that. And while the exact economic impact remains unknown, it is clear that the current emergency will have an enormous impact on the city's finances at a time when a historic number of residents are unemployed and the need for city services has never been greater. We have other financial challenges. Historically, we have under budgeted police costs for the demand of services. The city has consistently underfunded the actual cost of overtime needed to meet rising costs and demand for police services. In the past, city revenues have covered the additional spending, but this revenue no longer exists in this current economy. We have a structural deficit in our current budget. Oakland has covered a structural deficit for years, meaning that the expenses have chronically grown much faster than revenues, even in good times. And this primarily is driven by rising personnel costs like medical benefits and pension contributions mandated by the state. We have over $2 billion, and that is with a B, dollars in unfunded liabilities. The long-term unfunded liabilities the city has to pay for employee pensions and retiree health benefits and deferred capital maintenance greatly exceed the resources to meet those obligations by more than $2 billion. And we have close to $50 million in negative fund balances. Numerous funds outside the general purpose fund have negative balances totaling more than $50 million. The city has a policy in place to systematically reduce those negative balances, but that policy has been suspended as part of our attempt to balance this year's deficit. Closing the gap. What have we done to close the gap this year? I commend the city. The city has taken swift action to begin to close the initial budget shortfall and projected gap. We've used 100% of our rainy day reserves, 100% of it. We've reduced police and fire services. We've released more temporary and part-time workers. We implemented a hiring freeze. We reduced wages for the unrepresented, our non-union employees. And we suspended payments to long-term retiree health care. We essentially decided, in order to close this gap and to do our best to continue services at this point in time, that we were going to set aside some of our prudent fiscal policies to help the residents of Oakland. And these actions have helped close the gap by about $27 million of the projected $72 million deficit. But we still have a deficit this year of $44 million. And we have to figure out how to close that. Otherwise, we're closing it in the biennial next year. And absent immediate and significant solutions, the general purpose fund could become insolvent, meaning we won't be able to pay our obligations out of that fund. The fiscal year 2021 deficit. Next fiscal year actually looks a wee bit worse, actually quite a bit worse. As dire as the deficit is this year, next year looks worse. If we don't act now, the deficit will be compounded over time. We must make the hard decisions now to avoid having to make heartbreaking decisions later. And that is really what we all need to think about. What are we going to do now to ensure that we can provide these services in the coming 2 years? The city's preliminary estimate for fiscal year 2021-23 budget cycle indicates a deficit of approximately $274 million across all funds. We have to figure out how to close that gap by the time we bring a budget to you on May 1st. And what happens if we don't balance our budget? If our deficits continue to grow, Oakland could be extremely vulnerable to insolvency. The services we provide would be devastated, and we would be unable to respond to an emergency. To address the fiscal crisis, the city is doing everything that it can to prevent long-term devastating cuts to our budget. Like as previously noted, we have exhausted our rainy day fund, and we are now trying to avoid draining our emergency reserves. But again, good news is on the way, and we are so grateful to our federal government and our partners in Washington. The Federal American Rescue Plan, which you'll hear referred to as ARPA, will certainly provide relief. The $1.9 trillion package recently signed by President Biden is the first to include direct aid to local governments, specifically to address our revenue losses, while continuing to send more direct aid to our most vulnerable residents and small businesses. The City of Oakland will receive an estimated $192 million in American Rescue and ARPA funds to help address our massive revenue loss. While it's not the full amount we need to completely address our projected shortfalls, over the next 2 fiscal years, it will help us get much closer to closing the gap and taking us from considering catastrophic reductions to only difficult ones. It's very, very important, though, as we talk about ARPA funds, that we understand that these are one-time revenues. And our biggest ongoing expense are our employees that provide the services to you. The allowable uses of these fundings presently include backfilling loss of city revenue due to COVID-19 and other COVID-19 related services. And as Kat said, we'll be releasing this budget on May 1st, and we are very excited about it. And that is where the fun part of bringing a budget to the public begins, where we all get to sit down and have that dialogue and have those discussions and debates about how we spend this money. So again, please get involved and visit our website, oaklandca.gov//budget. Bring your ideas, bring your conversations, and we are looking forward to seeing everybody in May. And I think I'm turning this over, but
yeah, I believe Caleb Smith from my office is going to explain how people can get into their breakout rooms and how the rest of this budget summit will work to allow you to make some deep dives into the issues that matter to you. For those of you who are not following the chat, I've been responding to some questions about the federal aid that is coming through American Rescue Act. And as well as some questions about whether or not there might be similar aid coming from the state of California, which does not seem to be the case. And as far as the surplus goes, I think the big city mayors of California are going to focus our advocacy to increase homelessness funding. That remains our biggest issue. And now that the federal government has helped our budgets, we really want to focus on our most vulnerable. So with that, Caleb, can you tell everyone how they can get into their breakout rooms?
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Margaret. So now we are going into our first breakout session. These breakout sessions will be 30 minutes long. First, they'll start with presentations from city leadership, and then 20 minutes of question and answer. I will open the breakout rooms now. The top